I want to talk with everybody today about something which 99.9% of our viewers have never, ever even heard of. And that is that there actually exists 2 entire surahs that were written and preserved that are not placed in the current Quran, but narrations state that these surahs were from the Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد الإمام المهدينا وسلم تسليما السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. And my dear brother and companion Sanad.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sayyidi.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
God bless you. So today we're going to talk about a really important topic. And the topic is actually, it's an answer to a lot of people that consistently ask this question. The group of people that basically are Quranists, or they are people that reject largely the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and say that a lot of corruption has taken place and that the only thing that we are obliged to follow is the Quran. So they basically take the same stance as Umar ibn al-Khattab did on the night of or a few nights before the passing of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when they were all gathered at his deathbed, and he asked the Muslims to gather for him a piece of paper and a pen in order that he may write down something, right? A narration of his words, that if they would follow it, the nation would never go astray. He was interrupted rudely by one of the companions, and that one was Umar ibn al-Khattab. He was identified as Umar in other narrations. And he said the Prophet is delusional, he's hallucinating, he's unwell. The book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is enough for us. We have the Quran, we don't need anything else. So the people that take this stance and they reject the narrations and they only want to follow the Quran, these guys are the copy-paste images. These are the mini Umar ibn al-Khattabs that follow that particular path. And not just Umar, but some of the other companions such as Abu Bakr, that after the passing of the Prophet, for some reason, they decided that it would be too much of a fitna if the people continued to hold on to the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. They seemed to be afraid of what the Prophet might have told some people in secret. And so they gathered up all of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad and they commanded that it be burnt. And the only thing that remained be the Quran itself, right? Or the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the tongue of his messenger, the Prophet Muhammad But something really interesting takes place, And like I said, this episode, it's all geared towards responding to these people that continuously ask the question, if there is such a thing as an Imam and Mahdi, right? Or there is such thing as Mahdis, or if there is such thing as the Wilaya or the successorship of the Imams after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is an extremely important thing. Why hasn't this thing been mentioned in the Quran if it is so important and somebody's heaven or hell or afterlife would depend on it? And for the person who enters into Islam or was born into Islam and doesn't know any better, this is a very valid question. And it's a question that could cause a person to go into a state of doubt or not be in a place of certitude. And that's why I think it's extremely important that we address this particular topic.
Yeah.
First off, we want to say that in terms of the Quran itself, there is this myth that has been propagated, and we've mentioned it briefly in other in other episodes on this channel, but I want to go over it in more detail in this one. There is this myth that has been propagated that the Quran is complete. And the Quran, because of the verse in the Quran that says that we're the one that brought down the remembrance and we are the ones that safeguard it, they interpret this verse from the Quran to mean basically that they're the ones who brought down the Quran and it is God's duty to preserve it, and therefore the Quran can never be corrupted. The Quran as we have today between our hands is the exact same version in the exact same order as it came down on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning that all of the verses are in their correct places. It's not mixed up with each other. There are no verses that are missing from the Quran, and there's no verses that are added onto the Quran. And this is pretty much what most of the Muslims today believe. By the way, not just Sunnis, but most of the Shia, Marjas, and scholars and sheikhs, they also believe the same thing, or at least they propagate this same idea that the Quran of the Muslims, Sunni and Shia, for the most part, is the Quran that we have, which is the one that was compiled by the third of the so-called caliphs, or the so-called al-Khulafa al-Rashidin, after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when that was Uthman, and that's why they call it the Uthmani Quran. This narrative that they have completely goes against the ahadith, the narrations, and the view that the Khulafa themselves held, and the companions that were living in the time of the Prophet and the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's household themselves. All of them, the guided Imams and the family members of the Prophet, and those who usurped, right, and are considered to be the rightly guided caliphs of Sunni Islam, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and all of the remaining companions at that time and the generations that succeeded after that, they totally and utterly believed the Quran to be an incomplete book, that a lot of corruption had infiltrated into it, right? And that its form right now was not the same form that it was in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason why we know this is because of the evidence that was left behind. The second holiest book to the Sunnis, which is Sahih al-Bukhari, they consider it to be a compilation of the most authentic narrations, right, of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it preserves also in it the sayings and the words of the companions of the Prophet that lived with him, that first generation, is filled with narrations and sayings where the caliphs and the companions and the wives of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam are proclaiming the Quran to not be complete. You have also in the Shia sources narrations on the tongues of each and every one of the Imams from the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam that succeed the Prophet Muhammad, all the way up to the 12th Imam, Imam and Mahdi alayhi salam, all the Imams between those two, proclaiming that the Quran that we have is not in its current form, and that there's another Quran that was preserved, and that the meaning of the verse itself, or the meaning that God would safeguard the Quran, is explained in another verse where it says, وَكُلَّ شَيْءٍ أَحْصَيْنَاهُ فِي إِمَامٍ مُبِينٍ, and everything we have safeguarded in a clear Imam. So the Quran is safeguarded according to the household of the Prophet Muhammad, but it's not safeguarded in paper, right, on a written form, in a written form as a book. It is safeguarded in the heart, in the mind, in the soul of an infallible Imam that God would place on the earth in every day and age. And each Imam would inherit the real Quran from the Imam that was before. And so the Quran would never be lost, because there would always be an Imam who would preserve it generation after generation. And that is how God preserves the Quran, by His Spirit being amongst creation and being able to preserve that Quran, versus this idea or this notion that all human beings would have a preserved copy of the Quran through its written format that was compiled by the third of the caliphs, Uthman, after they burnt all other copies of the Quran and all other narrations that said otherwise. Yeah. The narrations of the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam also stated that there were many incidents that took place where people testified to, or the Imams narrated, that Imam Ali alayhi salam, after the passing of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he remained in his house for 6 months, not going anywhere, in order to accomplish his first task that was given to him by the Prophet. And the first task that was given to him by the Prophet was that he was to compile the Quran in its original form. So he was to write it down. And so he compiled for 6 months a book. He wrote down the verses of the Quran in the order that it came down, from the very first verse, right, all the way to the final verse, in order of revelation. In addition to that, he added into the book the interpretations that were given to him by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the zahir and the batin, the apparent meanings and the esoteric meanings of each verse, and the reasons why it came down, the circumstances and the names of the people in which the verses came down concerning. He wrote all of these interpretations and the tafsir down. So essentially, we have this book. It's a grand book, and it has in it the Quran in its entirety, and it has in that Quran a lot of verses and surahs that were not preserved in the Quran that we have today. And also in that book we have the entire interpretation and explanation of the Quran, so that the Muslim nation would never go astray. And according to the narrations, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he takes this book and he attempts to give it to Abu Bakr and Umar, and they reject and they say, we have our own Quran, we don't need your Quran, get out of here. And Imam Ali alayhi salam said, then you will never see this book again. It will remain with my family until the emergence of the Mahdi, and then it will be him who will take out that book and bring it forward to the people. And there are many narrations that state that the Qa'im comes with a new matter and a new jurisprudence, and he comes with a new book, and he restores Islam once again. He destroys what was before him, like the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam destroyed what was before Islam. So if the Prophet destroyed the idol worship before Islam, the Qa'im will destroy that which came before he does, and what comes before he does is a distorted version, idol worshipping version of Islam, in which the Muslims are followers more of these non-working scholars and of Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman, and the usurpers and the tyrants that took away the rights of the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam. The narrations continue, and they state that he comes with a new book, and they say that he comes and basically his companions will be setting up tents in the middle of Kufa. The non-Arab companions of the Qa'im will be teaching the Arabs the Quran as it came down. And so here in this narration, we have an indication, an implication, a very clear one, that is stating that the Quran that the people have now is not the true one, and that the true one will come down, or it's not in its true form, there's something wrong with it, and that as it came down, the Quran as it came down will be revealed by the companions who will accept the Qa'im, who most of them are non-Arabs, and most of them, it's easy for them to accept a different version of the Quran, as to where the people whom are Arabs that grew up on Islam will find it very difficult. And that's why the narrations state that the matter of the qa'im is something which is very hard, especially upon the Arabs and especially upon the Persians, and that there are very few of the Arabs that are with them, and narrations that state that his first enemies are the Arabs. He doesn't have any clearer enemies than the Arabs and the Persians. It's because they're the ones that have a vested interest in the preservation of the current version of the Quran because of the fact that they were propagating it, and they were the ones that speak its language, or at least the Arabs speak its language. And another narration mentioned that nothing will be more harder upon the person that has memorized the Quran than the memorization of the Quran in the time of the qa'im, because it comes down in a completely different form and way. And so those are a few of the many narrations that we have in Shia Islam which speak to this fact that there is a very big problem, and the problem is the corruption of the Quran. In terms of Sunni Islam, when you go over there and you look at Sahih al-Bukhari, it's absolutely filled, Muhammad, and you know that. It's filled with narration after narration after narration, in which the companions are stating that the Quran as it is not complete. You have, for example, Umar ibn Khattab himself, who was responsible for a lot of the burnings of the different versions of the Quran. It seems like he burned versions of the Quran that contained verses that he was attached to, you know. And after the burning took place, he realized it, and he was like, oh my goodness, well, what should I do now, you know? Because I do remember this verse, which was called the verse of the stoning. He really loved to stone people, and he couldn't find the verse anymore, and so he testified. He said, you know, if it wasn't for the fact that I don't want people to accuse me of making up verses in the Quran, I would have wrote down with my own hand, meaning I memorized anyway the verse of the stoning from the Quran, and unfortunately I can't find it. Nobody preserved it, so we're just going to have to do without it. Other companions said, in these Sunni narrations, they say nobody should say that they have memorized the entire Quran. Rather say that you've memorized what has survived from the Quran, because much of the Quran has been lost. Other narrations have companions in there in which they state that there were entire surahs from the Quran that were deleted, that weren't preserved in this new version that they have. Other companions mentioned that there were particular surahs in the Quran that were the size of even Surah al-Bara'ah, you know, which was over 100 verses that were lost, or that there were other surahs that were 2 to 3 times the size that they currently are, but a more condensed version. That's all that survived with the preservation of the Quran. Narrations indicate on both sides, Sunni and Shia Islam, that 2/3 of the original Quran is lost, is gone, and that only we have one surviving third of the Quran that is mismatched and placed in a different order, and that words were confused in there. And you have narrations on the Sunni side in which you'll have companions saying, for example, they want me to read this verse in this way, you know, but the way that I remember it is this way, you know. I remember that they said, وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَخْشَى وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا تَجَلَّى وَالذَّكَرِ وَالْأُنْثَى. But they want me to recite it in a different way, and they'll argue with one another about particular verses and particular surahs in this way. And you have in Shia sources tons of hadiths that basically have the Imams saying, don't recite the verse in this way. This is the way that the verse came down. You have Aisha, the very wife of the Prophet Muhammad proclaiming that there were parts of the Quran, verses of the Quran that was written and it was hidden underneath the bed, and it was eaten by a chicken or eaten by a goat, and that it was lost in that way. There were conversations in which she talked about verses that pertained to breastfeeding the adult, and that these verses verses were changed or were taken out of the Quran or condensed, mismatched, misplaced. And so you have a consensus by the family of the Prophet. And also, I wrote about this in The Goal of the Wise, and people can look at it and read about it in more details. They have to do is go to our website and go to the library section, and you can download and read The Goal of the Wise for free, or you can order a physical copy of it. And when you go to the chapter of the corruption of the Quran, I've placed in there a lot of explanation and evidence to the fact that there even exists today different versions of the Quran that are being sold actually in the Muslim world, and that if you go online, you can order these different versions of the Quran, and you can do a side by side comparison of them for your own self to verify that even today there's different versions of the Quran. So we're not even talking about something in the past, but nonetheless there's this consensus between the family of the Prophet, between the Prophet's companions, between his wives, between the caliphs, and between the people that came hundreds of years later, right? Decades and decades later, like, for example, the author of Sahih al-Bukhari and the author of Sahih Muslim, and these narration books, these were written hundreds of years later after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or over 100 years later, and they contain inside of it all of these narrations, which means that the person who preserved it and verified them to be authentic narrations believes in them and adopts these views, meaning that many generations after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Muslims were united in the fact that the Quran, which is currently with them, is not the true Quran, it's a different Quran.
Yes. Such a very important fact that you have proven very clearly, and it's quite and leaves no excuse to the people today to deny that the entire generation that was contemporary to the revelation of Quran and the people who have supposedly related to today, they all agree that it wasn't the version that Muhammad and the Ahlul Bayt had.
So we have here, I'm going to just point out a few parts of from the Goal of the Wise, a few narrations here that we have. For example, in Sahih Muslim, we have a narration in which Abu Musa al-Ash'ari states that we used to recite a surah which resembled in length and severity Surah al-Bara'ah. And I have, however, forgotten it with the exception of this, which I remember out of it. If there were two valleys full of riches for the son of Adam, he would long for a third valley, and nothing would fill the stomach of the son of Adam but dust. Isn't that incredible?
Indeed.
In Sahih Muslim, you have one of the companions reciting. How precious is this? How precious is this if we are looking upon a verse of the Quran that is not in the current Quran, that nobody's reciting anymore? And we're lucky enough to have that. Here we have that in Sahih Muslim. Sahih Muslim, we have this verse that they're saying was left out. He also said, we used to recite a surah which is similar to one of the musabbahat, and I no longer remember it, but this much I have indeed preserved. And he gives us another verse that's not in the Quran that we currently have. O you who truly believe, why do you preach that which you do not practice? And it also said, that is inscribed on your necks as a witness, and you will be examined about it on the day of resurrection.
Subhanallah.
Other companions, they proclaimed in Al-Itqani fil Ulum, another famous book which was written by Al-Suyuti. It says in there that other companions claimed that 2/3 of Surah Al-Ahzab went missing. The narration states, what is the extent of Surah Al-Ahzab? And then the companion states 72 or 73 verses. Then he says, one of the other companions says, yeah, it used to be equal to Surah Al-Baqarah. And in it, we recited the verse of stoning.
Wow.
What is the verse of stoning? He replied, and then he recites the verse. He says, the fornicators among the married men, as-sheikh, and married women, as-sheikha, stone them as an exemplary punishment from Allah, and Allah is mighty and wise. So this seems to be the verse that Umar ibn Khattab was claiming was missing. They found it, he recited it, they preserved it in these outside sources from outside the Quran. So the Muslims themselves, they're stating that the Quran is corrupt. And actually they have these verses, kind of a lot of them, some of them, here and there in these different books. And Aisha, here's the narration. She says, no doubt the verse of stoning and the breastfeeding of adults by 10 sucklings was revealed, and it was on a paper below my bedding. When the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and his family died, and we were busy, a goat entered and ate it. So she's basically saying that there's a different part of the law. Okay?
Yes.
Just like Umar ibn Khattab said. Umar ibn Khattab said that there's a different part of the law. There's a part of the Sharia, the jurisprudence now. Islam is not even being practiced as it should. There is an obligation upon us. That obligation, or that part of the law, is that if there's an old man and an old woman who fornicate, we have to stone them. But we didn't stone them. Okay, we don't stone them anymore because that verse didn't survive. So we're not practicing Islam as it should. We're not upholding the covenant as we should. Aisha is saying the same thing, that there's this part of Islam where if there's a man and a woman that are not mahram on each other, right, that are not related to each other, if you want to make them related to each other, then, for example, if you and there's another woman that's not your sister, not your mom, not your relative, not your wife, not your daughter, if you want to be around her and be able to hug her, kiss her, just like a son would do his mother, or a brother his sister, and never be able to marry one another, well, there's a solution for that. And the solution, according to her, was a verse that came down in the Quran where a woman, an adult woman, can breastfeed 10 times a man, and then by that man breastfeeding from her, he becomes mahram on her. Now, I'm not saying that that's correct. What I'm saying is that we have here examples of these companions and the generations afterwards stating that there are verses that are mentioned from the Quran. Do you get it?
Yes.
A lot of people, they would object and they would say, absolutely not. We're not going to take some narrations and we're going to use them to disprove the Quran that's between our hands, that we know, or that the Quran says that it's preserved. And this is the miracle of the Quran. And the problem in that is that you have narrations from Muhammad and the family of Muhammad alayhi salam, and from the messenger himself, that state that the Quran cannot be interpreted without a companion or without a guide or without an imam who will explain it. And that's the reason why there's so many sects that exist, and they're all fighting one another from after the death of the Prophet Muhammad up until the current day. Now, you'll remember in Islamic history, it's extremely ugly. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, what happens is that Muslims break down into two groups. One group of Muslims are fighting against another group of Muslims. There's armies of 70,000 people battling against one another. And on one side you have companions like Talha and Zubair, and you have like Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, going out to lead an army, sitting and riding on a camel against the Prince of the Believers, and the husband of the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, and his cousin and his successor, Imam Ali alayhi salam, and his companions on one side, and they're fighting a vicious fight against one another. And this is because the guide of the Quran is no longer there, and these Muslims now are in difference with one another over the meaning of the verses and over the religion itself. And so the book has to have its author with it, or the companion of the book, the person who preserves it, And that's essentially what the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam are stating. There's also this other thing that the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam said, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa said, he really emphasized on this, and his Ahlul Bayt emphasized on this, that there is this golden rule that exists. And the golden rule is that if you hear a narration from Muhammad or attributed to Muhammad or the Ahlul Bayt, you are not allowed as a Muslim to deny it. No matter how absurd it seems, you cannot deny the information, especially if you are in doubt about its source or you don't know if it's true or false. So the Muslims nowadays, what they want to do is they want to hear these narrations, they want to put their fingers in their ears like the people in the time of Noah, when in the Quran it says that they put their fingers in their ears and they covered their faces with their clothing in order to not hear the message. The Prophet Muhammad said, this is entirely false. You can't do that. If anybody comes to you, right, saying that the Prophet Muhammad or his Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam said something, you are obliged to, you are forced to accept it rather than deny it. You must accept and assume that it's true instead of denying it and assuming that it's false until the matter is clarified. So the right thing to do, the automatic reaction that the believer must have, is that he accepts those words that are attributed to the Prophet or to the Messenger, lest they deny something which was really said by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that means that it was really said by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by that action they would have belied God from above His throne and the Messenger and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and that is a grave sin. And so if you receive a news, if it's false or a made up one, then the sin of believing in it falls upon the shoulder of the person who lied and who made up the narration, until you find out for sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that it is something which is belied. After you take it back to Muhammad and the family of Muhammad and you ask them about it. But you never belie it, because belying the narrations is belying God Almighty. And so taking that line of thinking, of accepting and obeying that command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the tongue of the Prophet Muhammad and his messenger, accepting these narrations, that means what? That means that we have to accept all narrations unless proven otherwise, unless we have an infallible who tells us, right? So there's no such thing as now ilm al-rijal, or the study of the to scrutinize the narrators and the companions and say this was a trustworthy person or this was not a trustworthy person. We have to throw that all outside of the window. And by the way, that's exactly what the major Shia books that were written by Majlisi and other than them, some of the narrations you'll have in there that the Shia accept narrations that have a chain of narrators, and then a lot of the times you'll have a Sheikh al-Sadiq or al-Majlisi or these guys, they relay the hadith directly from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam or directly from the tongue of the Imam without a chain of narrators, because the Shia accept it and they quote these narrations and they use them because they know that the chain of narration and the science of or the school of thought that is interested in studying the reliability of the men, this is a science that in it and of itself is unreliable, because there's no way to tell for sure without a shadow of a doubt 100% as a fact that this narration came from the Prophet or not, except if you return it to a member of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam and you ask them. So the normal thing which we must do is accept all narrations. This is what the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam commanded us to do. We have to assume its authenticity, that it's authentic, all right, before we assume that it's false, so that we don't belie God. And that means that we also have to assume that these verses that were brought to us, which were alleged to be from the Holy Quran, that we never, ever deny any of them. Just denying one of these narrations or one of these verses from the Quran, right, without the infallible Imam telling us that these are not from the Quran, could lead us to enter into hellfire.
Yes.
That takes us now to something really, really important and interesting, which I want to share with everybody today. And that is this topic of these two surahs that are not in our current Quran. So far, we've examined the narrations, and we've had in those narrations them quoting particular verses. But I want to talk with everybody today about something which 99.9% of our viewers have never, ever even heard of. And that is that there actually exists two entire surahs that were written and preserved that are not placed in the current Quran, but narrations state that these surahs were from the Quran. One of them is called Surah al-Nurayn, the surah of the two lights. And another surah is called Surah al-Wilaya. Have you ever heard of these two?
No.
Yeah. So we're going to take a moment, we're going to read Surah al-Wilaya, and we're going to take it from there and share it with the people for the very first time. Are we ready?
Allahu Akbar, of course.
Bismillah al-Wahid al-Qahar. يا أيها الذين آمنوا بالنبي وبالولي الذين بعثناهما يهديانكم إلى صراط مستقيم نبي وولي بعضهما من بعض وأنا العليم الخبير إن الذين يوفون بعهد الله لهم جنات النعيم والذين إذا تليت عليهم آياتنا كانوا بآياتنا مكذبين إن لهم في جهنم مقاما عظيما إذ نودي لهم يوم القيامة أين الظالمون المكذبون للمرسلين ما خلفتهم المرسلين إلا عني وما كان الله ليظهرهم إلى أجل قريب وسبح بحمد ربك وعلي من الشاهدين. In the name of Allah, the One, the Conqueror. O you who believed, believe in the Prophet and the Guardian, whom we have sent to guide you to a straight path. A Prophet and a Guardian, each from the other, and I am the All-Knowing, the All-Aware. Indeed, those who fulfill their covenant with Allah will have gardens of bliss, and those who, when our verses are recited to them, disbelieve in our verses, indeed for them in hell is a great place. When it is proclaimed to them on the day of resurrection, where are the wrongdoers who denied the messengers? I did not appoint the messengers as successors except by my command, and Allah would not make them apparent until a near term. And glorify your Lord with praise, and Ali is among the witnesses. As far as this surah, that's the surah of the Wilaya, that is allegedly 7 verses, there are narrations that have been preserved, actually, that state that it's longer than that. And this particular surah is significant because of its contents, and you'll understand why. So in this narration, it's a narration from Jabir Jafi, and it's available on some manuscripts that were handwritten. And this narration itself, it states that Jabir Jafi basically says that he asks Imam al-Baqir from him his light about the Quran. And he asks him the very question which we posed at the very beginning of this episode, which is, why is not the Imams, the Mahdi, the names of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam in the Quran if they're so important, right? And that's something that we hear a lot from Sunnis, and certainly we also hear from other people from other sects and other religions.
Yes.
Oh, Jabir, would he mention the spider and the mosquito and the flies and the lice and not mention our names, the Ahlul Bayt? Verily, they, meaning the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt, deleted these names of ours from the Quran in hatred of Ali and Fatima. Jabir said, "Oh, my master, can you show me the place of that in his book?" And so he said, in a surah that they have deleted. and in verses that they have corrupted. And what I shall give you, hold tight to it, or else they shall cut off your hands and your legs from the opposite sides. Know, Jabir, that it is Surah أنزلناها وفرضناها وأنزلنا فيها آيات بينات لعلكم تذكرون. A surah which we brought down and we made it obligatory, and we brought down in it verses that are clear in order that you may remember. And then he recites the following surah, which is the surah of the Wilaya, but with an extension. So the surah of the Wilaya, it's 7 verses, and it's available out there, and this is with an extension to it. It says, بسم الله الواحد القهار يا أيها الذين آمنوا بالنبي والولي الذين بعثناهما يهديانكم إلى صراط مستقيم نبي وولي بعضهما من بعض وأنا العليم الخبير إن الذين يوفون بعهد الله لهم جنات النعيم فالذين إذا تليت عليهم آياتنا كانوا بآياتنا مكذبين إن لهم في جهنم مقام عظيم نودي لهم يوم القيامة أين الضالون المكذبون للمرسلين ما خلفهم المرسلين إلا بالحق. So it's a little bit different than the other one. وما كان الله لينذرهم إلى أجل قريب فسبح بحمد ربك وعلي من المشاهدين. Instead of الشاهدين, in this version it says المشاهدين. وفاطمة نوري وبها أستعين وذريتها أوليائي هدى للمؤمنين حسن وحسين وعلي الساجدين ومن ذريته ثامن السامعين إني خلقت السماوات والأرض بنورها المبين فاسجدوا لها إن كنتم بها موقنين سأطوي السماء باسمها الكريم والأرض أجعلها جنة للصابرين والذين ظلموا نوري أولئك سأمسخهم أجمعين أبدانهم كأنها أبدان الشياطين أولئك أصحاب فرعون وهامان وإبليس المنذرين والذين استجابوا لأبنائها المهديين الله أكبر تحملهم رياح نجائب والأولين أولئك شيعتها لهم الفائزون يوم يقوم ابنها المستعين ذلك يوم لا ينفع الظالمين يولون منه فرارا خائفين إن المؤمنين هم المسلمين فلا تكونوا من الغافلين وتوبوا قبل نزول آمين ثم قال والحمد لله رب العالمين. And then he said, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, my master, I have full certitude in you. He said, yes, O Jabir, and if it wasn't for that, we would not have picked you.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Subhanallah, glory be to God.
So, Jabir al-Jafi says, he said, I asked the one who knows, meaning Imam al-Bakr, from him is light about the Quran and whether Allah mentioned your name in it. He said, O Jabir, does the spider and the mosquito and the fly and the lice get to be mentioned in the Quran and our names not mentioned in the Quran? What do you think? The people of the house will not be mentioned while the fly and the spider and these little critters are mentioned? By Allah, they omitted them out of the hatred that they had towards Ali and Fatima. Jabir says, oh my master, clarify to me then, where is it in his book? He said, in a surah that they have omitted and in verses that they have altered. And what I will inform you of it, keep it secret, otherwise they will cut off your hands and feet from the opposite sides. And know, O Jabir, that it is the surah that is referred to in the Quran, in the verse that says, a surah which we have sent down and imposed. And in it we have sent down clear verses that perhaps you may remember. So this verse in the Quran, this one that says, وَسُورَةً فَرَضْنَاهَا, is referring to Surah al-Wilaya. And Surah al-Wilaya, he's saying, is a surah that mentions in it the names of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. And this surah was altered And the names of the Ahl Bayt were taken out, which we saw in the first version of Surah al-Wilaya that's around. We didn't find in it the names of the Ahl Bayt. It was only 7 verses. The rest of it was cut off. And then eventually the entire surah was taken out of the Quran altogether. And then he quotes the surah itself and he says, "In the name of Allah, the One, the Conqueror, O you who have believed, believe in the Prophet and the Guardian whom we have sent to guide you to a straight path. A Prophet and a Guardian, each from the other, and I am the All-Knowing, the All-Aware. Indeed, those who fulfill their covenant with Allah will have gardens of bliss. And those who, when our verses are recited to them, disbelieve in our verses, indeed for them in hell is a great place." So here's a great warning, even in the surah itself, in the verse itself, that those who hear verses of the Quran and then they deny it for whatever reason, these people are going straight into hellfire.
Yes.
When it is proclaimed to them on the day of resurrection, "Where are the misguided ones who denied the messengers? He did not appoint the messengers as successors except with the truth, and Allah would not grant them respite until a near term. So glorify the praises of your Lord, and Ali is amongst those who watch, and Fatima is my light, and through her I seek assistance, and her offspring are my guardians. Guidance for the believers, Hassan and Hussein, and Ali the prostrators, and from his offspring the 8th of the listeners." So obviously there's a play on words. Ali as-Sajjad is mentioned in there, wa Ali min as-Sajidin, right?
Yes.
It means that they're all prostrators, but it's a specific one because Ali, son of al-Hussein, his nickname was as-Sajjad, or the prostrator. "I created the heavens and the earth by her clear light, so prostrate to her if you have certitude in her. I will fold the heavens by her noble name, and the earth I will make it a paradise for the patient. And those who have wronged my light," meaning Fatima and her Ahl Bayt, her children and her husband, "those I will put into maskh, as if their bodies are like the bodies of the devils. Those are the companions of Pharaoh, Haman, and Iblis, the ones who have been granted respite. And those who responded to her sons, the guided ones, the Mahdis." All right, so now it's referring to the 12 Mahdis that come after the 12 Imams. You have in the surah, it mentioning in there by name Ali and Fatima and Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein and Ali Zayn al-Abidin or Ali as-Sajjad, and then the 8 from her sons, which are the remaining 8 Imams that lead to Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam. And then you have a reference to the Mahdis. Who are the Mahdis? "They will be carried by the winds of my chosen, and the first ones. Those are her followers, Shia, and they will be the victorious ones, the ones who support the Mahdis. On the day when her son, the one who relies on God, will rise." So that's a reference to the Qur'an. "That is a day when the wrongdoers will not benefit. They will flee from him in fear. Indeed, the believers are the Muslims, so do not be among the heedless and repent before the descent of Ameen."
SubhanAllah. Incredible.
It is incredible, isn't it?
Incredible.
So we'll leave that for food for thought for the people, and inshallah we'll meet together in another episode. And alhamdulillah rabbil alameen, and sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad, wa sallam taslima.